exactly the same things. In your work on animal cognition, you use this term umwelt, which is like the implicit motivational environment in some sense that an animal might inhabit. And I'd like to talk about that in a bit. But men and women don't compete within their own sexes for status in the same way. And so it's easy for men to look at women and think, well, they're not that competitive. Well, they're not engaged in rough and tumble play or violent confrontation. But that doesn't mean that the competition isn't there. It's just that, and it also may be that men aren't subtle enough in some sense to see it.
No, let me tell you a funny story on that. This was a woman scientist in Finland who studied children at play in the playground. And she said, if you watch these children, at the end of the day, you say that the boys had 5 times as many or 6 times as many fights as the girls. And that's just from watching them. If she asked the kids at the end of the day, did you have a fight today? The boys and the girls had equal numbers, which means that the girl fights are just not visible. And she said, if a girl walks up to another girl and that girl turns around and walks away, they consider that a fight.
Right. Well, that's very interesting.
But of course, boys will not consider that a fight. More needs to happen. Yeah.
No, the boys are not maybe even astute enough in some sense to notice that.
Yeah.
You know, the thing an antisocial girl will do is she'll, like an unfamiliar girl or even a familiar girl, will approach a play group that's already in formation, say, and the alpha female of the play group will say, we don't have to play with you. And that's devastating, right? Because it's a real cardinal inclusion, but there's no physical aggression associated with it. And the girl who's rejected will walk away crushed because she's been put down as unacceptable socially. That all can happen, especially if the girl bully is sophisticated, you know, because then an adult can come in there and call her on it, and she'll say, oh, well, she's just oversensitive. I didn't really mean that at all. And with a perfect facade of angelic innocence as well, which the antisocial female types are very good at mimicking.
These differences are so interesting, these sex differences that we see in human behavior, but they're not well documented. So recently I received a handbook on, I think it's developmental psychology or something like that. And I looked for gender in there because I was writing on gender. And there was almost nothing on gender. So the play differences between boys and girls were not mentioned, but also the conflict differences that you now mentioned were not mentioned. It's as if the psychologists have decided that that's too sensitive as a topic to get into the sex differences of.
I think part of it is that they actually don't like the facts. So for example, when I've been looking at personality differences between men and women, and we did some of the cardinal work on that with the Big 5 aspect scale. So the truth of the matter is that temperamental differences between men and women, so gender differences, as measured by personality scales, which is the right way to measure it, they maximize in Scandinavia. So the more egalitarian the country, the bigger the gender differences, which is exactly the opposite of what the social constructionists would have predicted. Now, some gender differences decrease, so men and women are more likely to be in the workplace now than 40 years ago. But if you make an egalitarian society, you actually maximize gender differences, which is, no one expected that, and it just flies in the face of this sort of early Margaret Mead-like social constructionism. And then you add to that so that accounts that plus the difference in interest, which is relevant to your work. So girls are reliably more interested in people and boys reliably more interested in things. So that's, say, dolls and cars or toy cars. And that also maximizes in the Scandinavian countries. It's 1 standard deviation, the difference. It's the biggest personality difference between men and women that we know. And it accounts for a huge amount of the variance in occupational choice, like between, say, engineering and nursing, which would be the cardinal examples. And so the psychologists look at that and they think, oh my God, that isn't how we want it to be. And so they don't talk about your work, and they don't talk about toy preference differences, and they don't talk about temperamental differences. It's all like shunted under the carpet.
So you mentioned Margaret Mead, who is often mentioned in the context of cultural construction of gender differences. But I reread her book Male and Female. And she has a whole section in there about what she calls universal differences between men and women. So she, and in a later edition of her book, she said if she had to write it today, this was in the 1960s, her book was, I think, published in the 50s. She said if I would write it today, I would bring in more biology, the biology of the differences between men and women. And so one of the differences that she mentions is that men always want to accomplish something. They want to be better at something than other men or women. They feel that's their goal in life, so to speak. And she mentioned that as a universal thing in men. She mentions also, of course, the childbearing capacities of women and the interest in children of women and the interest of women in the well-being of others and of themselves and their family. And so she mentions in that chapter quite a few things that I think are universal sex differences.
Well, let's.
So she was more open-minded, I would say, than her followers in that regard. Yeah.
Well, so this desire to be better at something. So let's take that apart a bit in light of our discussion. If you're cynical about that, you can say, well, that desire to be better at something is nothing but a manifestation of that power and dominance drive, right? And so it's to be competitive urge is to be discouraged because it's a zero-sum game and one person always gains at the expense of another. But if you look at even the animal literature in a sophisticated way, you think, wait a minute, competence is associated with heart status. It's very sophisticated. It's a competition for competence, even among animals, and even more so among human beings. And so that ambition that young boys manifest can easily be manifested in the service of social goods. And furthermore, and this is the thing that's so awful about it for me, is that that's actually the primary thing that male humans have to offer females, which is, well, look, of course I want to be better at something because I want to be differentiated economically, and to be paid for something, you have to be better at it than others. Otherwise, no one will pay you. They'll pay someone else. And so what I see happening to boys in our culture, and I've seen this with thousands of people, is that their ambition is being quelled because it's associated unthinkingly with power. And that undermines their entire commitment to the social and the sexual and interpersonal enterprise.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of suppression of those tendencies. Yeah.
So, okay, so maybe we could move to, if you don't mind, to the animal cognitive front. You talked about cognitive ethology, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that too. You wrote a book whose title I don't remember precisely, but it's something like, "Are we smart enough to